Charity. So without further ado, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here to have an opportunity to share some Torah again. So thank you to Stephen. I haven't quite checked our WhatsApp conversation, but it was a number of months ago.
Yeah.
And Stephen books me in when it's going to be a school holiday, and I'm available to be here. In truth, I didn't quite realize I would have been making a bris 2 days before. Friends of mine who just commented, just, I don't know why you're here. Why are you doing this? You just made a bris. Go home. But very, very excited to be here. But you'll indulge me and perhaps have some empathy of I am going to be doing some recycling this morning. In as much, I'm not going to repeat something that I've said in this room or in the shul here before, but it is something that I did say at the bris Suda. So you're going to indulge me. I've been very much in the parsha, in the topic of bris milah over the past few weeks. The bris of our son was not on time, so we've been thinking about it for about 3 weeks of when's it going to be and what's going to be with the bris and how are we going to arrange it. It was just after 3 weeks. But I've been thinking about that mitzvah and came across some interesting insights into the mitzvah of Brit Milah that I thought we can learn many things from, and we're going to try and share together. So I want to start off by going through a beautiful piece from the Sefer Kad HaKemach. Now, the Sefer Kad HaKemach was written by Rabbi Bechaya, who many of us will be familiar with, wrote a beautiful parish, a beautiful commentary on the Chumash. He was one of the great Spanish commentators of the golden age of Spanish Jewry, where you had these huge personalities that become part of our lexicon of Torah sages, the Rambam, the Rashba, the Ritva, all of these great sages that all took themselves or lived or grew up in Spain. Some of them moved on from Spain, obviously with the Inquisition, which changed the balance of the life of the Jewish people there. But the Rabbeinu Bechai was one of those, and he wrote a sefer of Jewish thought, Hashkafa and Musa, and he called that sefer the Kad HaKemach. It's written in order of the letters of the Aleph base, and he picks with each letter a particular mitzvah or topic, which he then discusses at some length. So the later commentators that do a similar idea, like the Hello Yoetz, seems to be they got this idea from the Sefer Kad HaKemach. And he starts off by introducing a perhaps obvious but interesting and insightful idea, which is that mitzvahs milah, the mitzvah of Brit Milah, is ka'ain korban, is like bringing a sacrifice, like bringing an offering. He says in a very simple way, both involve some kind of bringing of an offering of something in which blood was part of it. Obviously, a huge and important part of every korban was the blood that was often an integral part of that actual procedure of bringing the korban. It was sprinkled at various points in the Mizbeach. There were drops of it put at different points of the altar. And so too with the mitzvah of Brit Milah. On the 8th day, the blood is drawn, and that is part of the mitzvah of Brit Milah. So there seems to be this obvious comparison between the two. He also continues to say that explains a minhag that seems to be a long established one, and we'll see how long established it was, I want to suggest soon, of having a Sa'udah, having a mitzvah meal following the Brit Milah. We know there is this custom of having the Brit Milah. There's a special benching, the introduction to the benching. There's a special harachamans that are said during the Birkas Hamazon. But there is a mitzvah to have a Sa'udah at the Brit Milah. Now, by the way, in the various stages of when we were thinking the Brit of our son would happen, it's important to know that Brit does not have to happen immediately after the Suda, does not have to happen immediately after the Brit Milah. It can happen later on, even the next day. And there was at one point, it looks like that was what was going to happen. There was a possibility of a Brit taking place just before Shkia on Shabbos and then doing the meal the next day or that evening, which would have been totally halachically acceptable. Some of you, by the way, may have seen a picture a few weeks ago of one of the Yemenite poskim in Israel, Rav Mahbud, who you might know from his meat that is sold there in Israel, who is also a mohel. And there was a photo of him about 4 weeks ago performing a Brit Milah on the side of a highway in Israel on the back of the car. You saw this, Jeremy? Yeah. Yes, there was a whole story that it was an Erev Shabbos. There was a Brit Milah, and there was the mother and the baby in one car, the father in another car. The father, I think, got waylaid by a police car from taking a shortcut that was unadvised, we'll put it that way, and was unable to get to the Brit. The time, there was a big traffic jam, and in the end, the time was running out before Shabbos came in, and they managed to get, I think with a police escort, to get Rav Mahmoud through to where the baby was in the back of his car with the mother. And he said, if the father's not here, we can still do it. The father doesn't have to be there as long as he's appointed the Moira as a shliach, as his representative, and he does the milah there in the back of the car on the side of the road. I'm sure everything was sterile and it was safe. But it happens there at that moment in the back of the car, and we'll have suggestions afterwards on a postcard. Yeah, I hope not. I will have suggestions on a postcard afterwards of what they called the baby if it was in the back of the car. I'm sure we can think of some good ideas. But anyway, the Suda could be done there later. Anyway, back to the Kata Kemach. He says that just like a korban, after the korban was offered, it was eaten by the person that was bringing the korban. There was the meat or bread or matzah that was consumed by the person bringing the korban. So too at the Brit Milah, we have this custom of after the actual Milah, there is a meal which is shared together with family and friends. And he says that's the explanation of these ideas. And he continues, says even further, there's more connections. There's a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra that says, the first opportunity to bring an animal as a korban is from an animal is 8 days old. 8 days old. You can't bring it from a younger animal than that. Once it's 8 days old, you can. We know certain korbanos had to be a year old or more than that, but a minimum age for many korbanos was 8 days old. Beautifully, we see that the Brit Milah obviously is also on the 8th day. And he says there are many connections between the two. Now, what's interesting is discussed in the Sefer Kata Kemach is when we say simply that the Brit Milah is like a korban, is like an offering. Well, there are many different korbanos, many different offerings that were brought in the Torah, and Sefer Vayikra is full of them. There's a korban asham and a korban chatas and a korban shlamim. Each one had its own category, a peace offering or a sin offering. So when the Sefer Kata Kemach says that one can compare a Brit Milah to a korban, we could probably ask, well, which one? Which one? Which type of korban could we compare a Brit Milah to? Now, we know there is a minhag, which is a very early one from the Maharil, which is that if someone is served as a sandak for a particular family at a Brit Milah, then one should not serve for that same family. You should spread it around. I'm sure we're familiar with this custom. Those of you that have had the good fortune to perhaps be a sandak for grandchildren, then you shouldn't be offended if you're not asked again. It's not that you did a bad job, but there is this minhag of asking other people. The reason for that is the idea of being sandak is supposed to be a segula, a good sign for ashiras, for parnasa. Okay, still waiting. Yeah, for parnasa, for wealth, and therefore one should spread that bracha around rather than just give it to one person. There's many different ideas, but that's what the Maharil says. And the Maharil says, why is that? Because the lap of the person serving as sandak becomes like a mini altar. And on the mini altar, we know there was the altar that stood outside in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, in which they offered the daily ketores, the incense. And that was a segula, that was a good sign for wealth. So there are those that wanted to say, when the Sefer Kata Kemach suggests that Brit Milah is like a korban, maybe it's like the ketores, like the lap of the sandak, which one would offer the incense from, that would be a sign for good for wealth. However, it seems to be very difficult to suggest that that is what the Sefer Kata Kemach intends, because there's no detail of having to wait 8 days by the spices that were brought for the ketores. And in addition, there was no meal that took place after the ketores was offered, after the incense was offered. So it seems to me that's not what he was talking about. And I think the clue, though, is what type of korban is he talking about is in the pasuk that he quotes. He says that there is this fitting custom that when the people brought the offering, they would eat from them, they would get an atonement from it. And he says, Kain haminhag b'Yisrael, this so too is the minhag amongst the Jewish people, that they make a meal at the day of the Brit Milah, asfin hako, and everyone gathers together, ubayin sham, and they come there, minhag kasha, who is the proper thing to do. And he says, where do we see a hint to this idea in the Tanakh of gathering family and friends together to celebrate a Brit Milah? He says it's a pasuk in Tehillim. If we look at King David and what he wrote there in Kapitel Nun, in Perek 50, you'll see there the pasuk says, "Isfuli chasidai, gather together my pious ones, korisei brisi, the ones who I create my covenant with, I make my promises with, alai zebach, on my offerings." Says the Rabbeinu Bechai in the Sefer Kedar, that's the remez, the hint, this idea of gathering friends together, the Isfulei Chasidai Kosei Brisi, for the Su'udah. So, what type of korban are we talking about these people are gathering together for? It seems like that the one type of korban which people would have to wait to offer an animal till it was 8 days old, and would then have to share with their family and friends, is the korban toida, the thanksgiving offering. Why is that? The korban toida was unique, that when it was offered, it came with an accompaniment of 40 loaves of bread. 40 loaves of bread, a huge amount of food. The meat was eaten, and there was 40 loaves of bread that were accompanied it, that had to be then eaten within the city of Yerushalayim within a small time frame. The Netziv of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Bolozhny Yeshiva, and before the war, I had the merit of davening this past year actually at his kever on a trip to Poland. He's buried there in the Warsaw Cemetery. Those of you that visited it, it's an incredible place, and he's buried there next to Rav Chaim Soloveitchik from Brisk. He explains that the korban toida was eaten with friends, and it was have to be a unique offering that one did not only eat as an individual that was bringing the sacrifice, but you'd have to gather around friends and loved ones to share the offering with. And you see that from the sheer volume that had to be eaten in such a short amount of time. And in fact, he says that there is a hint to this idea in what we've been saying over the past week or so in Hallel. In Hallel, we have the words of Ma Ashiv La Hashem, that paragraph that we sing so beautifully in Shul. And he says that within that paragraph, there's clearly two dimensions of the korban, of the nadarim that we're talking about within that paragraph. There seems to be the actual sacrifice which is being offered. And then there's also a dimension of sharing that experience with other people. And he says, if you look at that perek, that chapter very carefully, you'll see running through in 4 different places in that paragraph, this dichotomy of the personal offering and the sharing it with family and friends. Let's go through the phrase by phrase. We talk about that, Nadarai LaHashem Ashale. I will fulfill my nadarim, my promises to Hashem, fulfilling my obligations of bringing an offering myself. Negda Lachol Amal, but I'll do it opposite all of the people. Everyone will see what I'm doing. It's not just about me. I'm going to share the experience with family and friends. Lecha ezbach zevach toida. To you, Hashem, I will bring a toida, a thanksgiving offering. Uvashem Hashem ekra. And I'll call out the name of God. I'll thank Hashem publicly. Others will know about that idea. And we're told from the Rishonim that whenever Avraham in Parshas Lech Lecha would build a mizbeach and call out in the name of God, he was publicizing one of the miracles that had happened to him. Hashem makes him promises before he leaves Ur Kasdim on his way to Haran, before he gets to Eretz Canaan, and each time he experiences the fulfillment of one of those divine promises, whether it's he comes back from Mitzrayim, now a hugely wealthy man, having been given gifts by Paro, he, on his way back into Eretz Canaan, he stopped, he builds an altar and calls out in the name of God and tells the people, look, this is the promise that God made to me, and he's fulfilled it. So we see that idea also of publicizing it in the name of Hashem. And the final sentence there, the final pasuk, B'chatzoi space Hashem, in the courtyard of the house of God, actually within the Beis HaMikdash where the offering was brought. How does that pasuk end? B'soichechi Yerushalayim. But within the city of Jerusalem, the meal would be eaten and shared with family and friends. And Siv says very beautifully, this idea in Tehillim of having a korban toida, which was a personal offering that was then shared publicly with family and friends as a celebration, is seen throughout. Now, we'll find an even greater proof that when the Sefer Kedar Kemach says that the korban of the Brit Milah can be compared to the korban toida, actually from Tehillim itself. We said, what was his source? There is such an idea of having a meal that was shared publicly with family and friends for the Brit Milah. The pasuk in Kapitel Nun in the 50th parak of Tehillim, which was Afsuli Chasidai, that you should gather all my pious ones, Karasei Brisi, the ones I've enacted my promises with. If we go back into that same paragraph, later on there, David talks about Zevach Le'elokim Toida, There I will offer to God a korban toida, a thanksgiving offering, Mishalem le'elyoy niderecha, and I will fulfill my promises to the one on high. So we can see David HaMelech was talking about the whole time in that chapter of Tehillim, a korban toida. Now, I want to continue just with one more idea that he mentions and the Sefer Kadakemach about the mitzvah of Brit Milah, which I think we can take a beautiful message from. The Sefer here says that one, through the merit of fulfilling the mitzvah of Brit Milah, is zoicher to be makabel pnei shechina. One encounters the divine presence through fulfilling the mitzvah of Brit Milah. A huge thing. By the way, we'll see very aptly that also where the Gemara in Yuma says that through fulfilling the mitzvah of hachnasus orchim, hospitality, one is also zoicha to be makabel the pnei shechina. We'll see why that is in a second, I think very beautifully, according to the Rabbi Bechaya. How does he know this idea? Well, if you look right at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, when Avram Avinu circumcises himself, has his Brit Milah, so the pasuk says that Avram ben Tishim B'Tesha Shana, he was 99 years old, v'himaloi basar olasari, and he circumcised himself. Be'etzem hayom hazeh nimol Avram v'Yishmael b'no. On that very day, Abraham circumcised himself and Yishmael his son. Yitzchak has obviously not been born yet at this stage, so he's not mentioned in the pasuk. And 2 psukim later, at the conclusion of Parshas Lech Lecha, we start the parsha of Vayera, which begins, Vayera alav Hashem be'elonei mamre. Hashem appears to Abraham. Says the Rabbeinu Bechaya, because he's fulfilled the mitzvah of Brit Milah, he now merits that Hashem appears to him to communicate with him. And we know Rashi famously comments, why does the Torah go out of its way to tell us where this takes place? There are many times where there's communications between Hashem and a Navi, but it doesn't bother to tell us exactly where it takes place. But here the Torah tells us that it was in Be'elonei Mamre, in the plains of a man called Mamre. Rashi says, Mamre was a balbris, a friend, a business partner of Avraham, and he gave Avraham advice to go ahead and perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah. Because of that good advice, Hashem merited him that his name would be mentioned in the Chumash throughout the ages, that Hashem appeared in his land. That's the shot that Rashi gives based on the Medrash. And the obvious kasha, the obvious question and difficulty with this Rashi and this idea, which many of the Mefarshim ask, is why does Avram need advice to fulfill a mitzvah he's been given by Hashem? We don't find this in any of the other tests of Avram. Even probably we can ask the greatest, we don't find by the Akedah when he's been told to sacrifice, to slaughter his own son that Hashem's promised with him, that he goes and consults with anyone and asks for advice. Do you think I should do this or not? Why particularly in this mitzvah does Avram need to ask advice? What possible advice is he asking for? The Maharal asks this, many others ask this. The Sifsei Chachamim brings an interesting answer. Avram was not in any way questioning whether he should fulfill the mitzvah of Brit Milah. Of course he should. Hashem himself had told him to do it. The question was, how should he fulfill that mitzvah? Avraham thought perhaps the mitzvah of Brit Milah should not be done like many of the other experiences that he'd had up until that point, but should be done in private. The idea of a 99-year-old man performing this operation on himself, which is obviously potentially dangerous and would have been strange to the people that lived around him, he thought, how can I be the one that goes around as the Kirov machine, we could perhaps call him? The greatest outreach organization was Avraham and Sarah that ever existed in Jewish history. Surely I'm going to alienate people. They're going to think I'm strange, I'm extreme, I'm spouting dangerous messages. So maybe I should do the Brit Milah. I should do it quietly and not tell anyone. So he asks his friend, Mamre, what do you think? And Mamre tells him, no, if Hashem's told you to do this, do it before Hesia. Do it publicly. Make a celebration. Let everyone know that you're doing it. That's the advice that Mamre gives him. And that's indeed what Avram does. So very beautifully, you can perhaps say, according to the Sefer Kadakemach, that there is this very early custom to gather friends and family to celebrate a Brit Milah. Who was the first one to make a Brit Milah Su'udah? Indeed, it probably was Avram, based on Mamre's advice. Make the Brit Milah, have the meal and share the news with family and friends that it's a public celebration of the mitzvah that Hashem has given you, which is a very beautiful insight. We'll finish with one final question, comparing the description the Torah gives of Avraham and Yishmael in having the Brit Milah. Avraham, we know, is praised by Chazal, by our sages, the fact that he has his Brit Milah at the age of 99. But Yishmael, we're told he has a Brit Milah, but he's not praised for it. There is a source in the Zohar, which I've seen brought down, that actually connects the descendants of Yishmael and their relationship with the land of Israel before Mashiach, in the merit of the fact that they perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah. But he's not praised directly anywhere in Chazal by the fact that he has a Brit Milah. Why is that? And in fact, the Psukim emphasize in a very considered and careful, specific way how Yishmael has his Brit Milah. The pasuk says, "V'yikach Avram es Yishmael benoi." Abraham takes his son Yishmael. V'Yishmael benoi shalosh esrei shana. Yishmael was 13 years old, and behimalos and basar olaso when he has his Brit Milah. Be'etzim hayom hazeh nimol Avram v'Yishmael benoi. Every single time, 3 times within a few psukim, Yishmael is referred to when having his Brit Milah as the son of Avraham. Now we know, because we've been paying attention up until this point, that Yishmael is definitely Avraham's son. Why does the Torah need to go out of its way to say 3 times over that Yishmael has the Brit Milah and he's Yishmael, the son of Avraham? So I saw one explanation in the Sefer here I have in front of me, the Darash David, that to have a Brit Milah at the age of 13 years old must have been a terrifying experience. Even watching his 99-year-old father do it, I don't know if that would have made it better or worse. Probably worse, let's be honest. And I think most teenagers would run a mile. So why is he not praised? So one explanation is sometimes we have people that rise to tremendous acts of bravery, of greatness, of integrity in actions they do, but they do it based on the influence that other people have on them. They're in a certain setting where they are carried along with the waves. They're inspired by a parent, by a teacher, by a Rav. And because of that influence, they manage to jump to some tremendously great action. But in of themselves, if they're in a setting where no one else is watching, they wouldn't really do it. Not really who they are yet, but they're just being inspired by another. How did Yishmael submit and agree to have his Brit Milah? Because his father Avram had such an influence over him, and we know that when Sarai wants to send Yishmael away because of negative influence, that she's worried Yishmael will have on her son Yitzchak. Avram says no. He believes in Yishmael, that he's going to be a tzaddik, he's going to grow up and to lead a life of greatness. Therefore, the Torah emphasizes that Yishmael is Avram's son. And the only reason he actually submits and agrees to have the Brit Milah is because of the influence of Avram. And we know later on in life, Yishmael leads a life which is much more questionable, although he does tshuva at the end of his life. And we see that idea in the actual kavura, in the burial of Avram, that he allows Yitzchak to lead him at the procession of the funeral, recognizing Yitzchak's succession as the leader of the Jewish people. But it's in fact only with Avram's influence that Yishmael agrees to have the Brit Milah, and that's why he's referred to in the pasuk as Yishmael Benoi 3 times to emphasize this idea. I think perhaps it's a very fitting message to end with, is the power all of us, whether it's as friends, colleagues, parents, those that have the good fortune to be grandparents already, of the positive influence we can have on our friends and family around us. That yes, we always want those people that are in our duty of care, whether it's family or friends or students, to take the ideas and messages that we are passing on to them, integrate them into themselves, so it becomes something which is acquired and part of their personality and their lifestyle. But we should not underestimate their influence we can have on others by being a positive influence on their lives. So to summarize, we've spoken about today the mitzvah of Brit Milah. We've seen 3 key ideas. The mitzvah of Brit Milah is compared to the Korban Todah, the thanksgiving offering, which is therefore why it had to be specifically from the 8th day, which is why it had to be shared with family and friends. And we saw the hint to that idea, the dichotomy of the personal sacrifice being shared with family and friends in Ma'ashiv, in Hallel. We saw the idea of through the mitzvah of Brit Milah, one is Zoicha, is merits to see and merit the divine presence, just as an aside, which is why perhaps we can say the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim, which is learned out from that very pasuk, of when Hashem appears to Abraham. That's why we see there the Gemara says one is Zocha to be Makabel Pnei Shechina, and also this insight of why the Torah emphasizes that Yishmael was the son of Abraham, that he had the Brit Milah not because necessarily he wanted to, because of the great influence that his father had on him when convincing him to have the Brit Milah. Okay, have a wonderful morning. Excellent question. A bris on Tisha B'Av, you do the bris on Tisha B'Av, and the Suda takes place after the fast. After the fast, yeah, immediately after the fast. Yes. Yeah, so except that the Moel and the Avia Ben, it's like yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Garth. Thank you very much. I'm going to switch off the Zoom. Those on Zoom, there's no share next week. It's the fast of Teva. It'll be in 2 weeks' time. There is